Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I thank you for joining me. I've got a special thank you and shout out to all the new listeners to Nostalgia Trap. I'm not sure how you found the show, but welcome and thank you. I wanted to let you know that I've been doing Nostalgia Trap for 10 years, so you can go back in the archives, and I hope not to be too embarrassing on those old shows. I think this show tracks a lot of what's changed in American history and in global politics in the last 10 years, but as much as it tracks that stuff, it's also a history of my own political evolution, my own sort of changing thoughts on many of these subjects. So I hope you're enjoying the journey and you're along for the ride with me. I think that we're all sort of thinking through a lot of our assumptions because we are in momentous times, and that's part of why I started this podcast. I wanted to create a record of my own thoughts, but also the thoughts and ideas of all the guests we've had on the show over the years. So if you don't know who I am just a guy from Ventura, California. I ended up getting a PhD in American history at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. And I wrote a book called Dangerous Grounds about the GI coffee house movement of the 1960s and 1970s. I'm interested in politics and culture and how those things intersect. I've been a professor of American history and media and film studies for more than 20 years now. So I bring that expertise, but I don't really want to cite that expertise. I really do think of myself as just a guy watching the world, and I try to bring in smart people that can help me shape my perspectives and help provide those perspectives to my listeners. So that's what we do, and each week I post something, either a podcast, an interview, or our News Trap episodes with my good friend Justin Rogers Cooper. He is a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College in New York City, and he has provided a ton of amazing commentary and analysis for us over the years, and his episodes are some of our most popular stuff, and I think that's well-deserved because the perspectives that Justin brings often help me figure out what's going on and what the right take on it might be, or at least an interesting take on it might be. So we've got a lot to say on the show. Obviously, we've got a lot to say about what's happening with our current dictatorship that is the Trump administration, but we'll be back next week with more News Trap episodes. We do not do advertising on this show, so you won't hear commercials. There is something, many people have told me, you need to do commercials. You'll make a lot more money if you do ads, but there's something in my Gen X soul that cannot bring myself to sell my listeners crap. So I don't have ads. And so the only way that we make money on the show is through our Patreon subscriptions. So if you have it in your heart, if you have it in your wallet, if you've got an extra $5 to send us and you appreciate what we do on the show, head over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And that subscription gets you access to tons of bonus episodes, all of our News Trap episodes, lots of good stuff on there. I've done a bunch of video lectures over the years, series on the Vietnam War, and a million other things. So go check that out, and you can actually subscribe and follow even if you're not paying for it. So it's a way to just sort of keep track of what we're doing and what we're putting up each week. I appreciate all of that, and I am very, very excited to bring this interview to you today. My guest today is Stephen Petrus. He's been on the show before to talk about his book, which came out in 2015 called Folk City, New York and the American Folk Music Revival. He is the director of public history programs at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives in New York City, and someone I know from the CUNY Graduate Center and Baruch College. We are old pals in the history department at those schools, history departments, I should say. And he's someone who thinks a lot about folk music, obviously, of the 1950s and 1960s, its place in the larger culture, in the larger political scene. And it made sense, I think, to bring Stephen on to talk about this movie, A Complete Unknown, which is out right now in theaters. It's on streaming as well. stars Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan. I couldn't get enough of talking with Stephen about this movie, about Bob Dylan, and about his place in the kind of larger streams of culture and politics of that era. So this was a really, really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And thanks so much for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. All right, here is my interview with Stephen Petrus. Well, all right, Stephen Petrus. It's good to see you again. How are
You
you?
too, Dave. And I'm doing great. Nice to see you as well.
We talked about this offline, that it was time, I think, to talk about Bob Dylan again. And in fact, I kind of think about like how often Bob Dylan has come up on Nostalgia Trap. I'm not sure if we've done a whole Bob Dylan show before, which is kind of incredible because in a lot of ways, and we'll get into this when we talk about the movie, A Complete Unknown, which came out last year and is still in theaters. I think now you can find it on streaming too. Dylan seems like he fits right in there with a lot of the themes we talk about on this show, particularly like the nostalgia for the 60s and kind of coming to terms with what that era did to us culturally and otherwise. But it's an era that you kind of sit in as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. My book, Folk City, grapples with the era, the folk music revival in New York City. Why did New York City become the epicenter of this nationwide boom in folk music from the late 50s to the mid 60s? So I really grapple a lot with different cultural trends, trends in music. And Dylan, of course, is a pivotal figure. I devote one chapter in the book to Dylan from 1961 when he arrived in New York as a 19-year-old to 1964. So this largely spans the film, A Complete Unknown, which of course culminates in 1965 with his infamous performance at Newport.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, this film is a pretty small slice of Dylan's biography. It's really, and that's what I appreciated about it. I think it's really about the sort of transition from like folk music and that sort of world to whatever Dylan becomes later and the tensions it created in that world. It's funny. I have coffee with my dad every Thursday morning, and I just got back from having coffee with him, and he graduated from high school in 1962. And I mentioned that I was going to come talk with a scholar of Dylan and folk music, and he said, "Man, that folk music was so popular in hye school." He's like, I never could get into it. He felt it was very. He used the word preachy, and I thought, wow, that's sort of the tensions that are at play in this movie a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was inextricably connected with politics, with nuclear disarmament in the early 60s, the critique of the military-industrial complex during the Cold War with civil rights. And there were many people on the left who go back to the 1930s and 40s associated with folk music who are still around in the 60s, like Pete Seeger, who's of course centrally portrayed in the film. Not that Pete was preachy per se, but there were many others too. So maybe that alienated your dad when he was in high school in the early 60s.
Well, yeah, it's funny because I was like, he didn't. My dad is not. I don't just. He's not a huge music guy, and I think he just had a. He didn't really like the stuff that came after either, the rock and roll stuff. But it's funny that tension, which comes out, in with Dylan playing, basically the electric guitar, is this. It captures this kind of binary that may or may not be as big a thing as the movie makes it out to be. This sort of hard split because I feel like. I mean, I guess the movie captures this a little bit. There were a lot of people in the audience that were booing, but they ended up liking that kind of Dylan rock and roll stuff anyway.
Yeah, that's right. The infamous booing in Newport in 1965, which is also a great question. I mean, there were 17,000 people in the audience that night in July
Wow, I didn't realize
1965.
it was that big.
Yeah, it was huge. It was a major event, right? And a lot of it depends on where you were situated physically, if you were up close or in the back. Some people jeered probably because of the short set, because of the poor sound quality. It's hard to know because the microphones were turned down and the amplifiers were turned up. So if you were up close, you couldn't appreciate Dylan's voice too well, but if you were back, maybe you could have. So it's an interesting thing. There certainly were boos, there were cheers. It was a mix, but it was the result of, I think, numerous factors.
What did you think as a guy who studies this stuff and who's written a book about New York City particularly? I mean, a lot of this movie takes place in that milieu. How did it come across to you? Because it's not something that hasn't been portrayed before. I mean, you've seen it in other movies, even like I'm thinking Forrest Gump and things like that show this world. But what do you think about a complete unknown?
I liked it, David, because of the music. I thought the music was exceptional, and I credit Timothy Chalamet, who poured his heart and soul into learning Dylan's extensive repertoire for about 5.5 years. He learned to play guitar, piano, harmonica. In fact, I met his guitar teacher in New York City, a guy named Larry Saltzman. And Larry told me that Timothy was an excellent student. He wasn't pretentious at all. He was really devoted and committed and inquisitive. He worked really hard, learned Dylan's extensive repertoire. He played about portions of about 40 songs, sang them all. And to me, the great music really made up for a lot of other inadequacies and shortcomings in the film. Um, I thought the acting was great, but as you indicate, the film from 1961 to 1965 really charts Dylan's rise to stardom from a 19-year-old arriving from Minnesota to Newport in 1965. There are other ways of portraying that rise. And so I'm critical of the film, not so much because of all the historical inaccuracies, and there were many of them. I'm not nitpicky, I'm not a stickler there, but there's a different way of understanding Dylan's ascent. And I think you look at the Greenwich Village milieu, the word you used, and think of it like an ecology of ideas, of individuals, of emerging singer-songwriters. And it doesn't really capture this environment, this ecology, Dylan's relationships with people like Dave Van Ronk, with Ramblin' Jack Elliott, with Paul Clayton, who, mind you, weren't household names like Seeger, Baez, Johnny Cash. But they were crucial. And I think we need to think of Dylan, again, a 19-year-old, let's not forget this, a dropout from the University of Minnesota. He was a college student, and he was very much like blotting paper, absorbing ideas around him, the music around him, reimagining it, synthesizing it, reworking it, making it his own. And you don't really get a sense of that. So I'm critical. The movie sort of portrays him as a bit of a lone wolf, a solitary genius, if you will. And that's a myth Americans like, the myth of the solitary genius who toils alone, who's misunderstood, but who ultimately breaks through, and there's resistance and jeering and booing and opposition, but is ultimately acknowledged as a genius. But it wasn't like that. It was more of a scene. Brian Eno talks about geniuses as opposed to geniuses. So the movie to me, despite the great music and acting, doesn't really convey or portray this vibrant Greenwich Village scene. And it wasn't just about music either. It wasn't just about the folk music revival, but there was the emergence of off Broadway, of independent film, kind of under the guidance of people like Jonas Mekas, off Broadway at Cafe Chino on Cornelia Street, Judson Memorial Church, the Judson Poets Theater. Um, there's emergence in pop art there. So there are all of these artists there in theater, in painting, in dance at Judson Dance Theater who are part of this constellation, if you will, who are exchanging ideas, and their risks are being applauded. You
Hmm.
are take a risk and you're embraced, you're applauded. And the movie doesn't really get that. We've got Joan Baez, Seeger, Johnny Cash, Woody Guthrie ailing in this Psychiatric Institute in New Jersey, but we don't get this broader environment. Even in politics, there were challenges to Robert Moses kinds of urban planning in Greenwich Village, challenges to Tammany Hall in Greenwich Village, led by the young Ed Koch.
Mm.
So there's a lot of challenges to conventional wisdom in both politics and the arts. And Dylan is part of this mix. In the movie, yeah, we don't really get a sense of that backdrop.
I love that idea of the scenius. I think that's great. That's a great way of thinking about this. And I think I mean I'm sure you've seen the Scorsese documentary No Direction Home, which was for me when I watched that years ago when it came out, it was an education in Dylan in a way that I'd never really thought before because I had always accepted in some ways that romantic vision, which the film repeats, that he's sort of the torch is passed from Woody Guthrie in almost this spiritual way. And they use the harmonica in this film as a sort of like physical icon of that torch being passed, which I loved and I appreciate it. And the romantic part of me watches that and gets why they did it as a Hollywood movie. But it also sort of, yeah, it ignores this folk scene. And even Dylan in No Direction Home in the documentary, he talks about that scene and the forces that made him. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, like how because there's folk music seems like it's timeless in some ways. You know, Woody Guthrie was working as a musician in the Dust Bowl in the 30s, right? And the 1940s. But there's a particular thing happening with folk music in the 60s, in the early 60s that you describe in your book Folk City that is a little bit different. It almost feels like that was a flash of something that I mean the film depicts not lasting really. But what was unique about that particular 60s vibe of folk music? Because it was, I mean, obviously, if you listen to what the American folk songbooks and stuff like that, they go back, to the 18th century, this music. But the 60s folk music was particular.
You're right. You're right. And I think what's distinct and unique, David, about the village scene in particular, even in contrast to Boston, Cambridge, was that we see the budding singer-songwriter, people like Phil Oakes, Eric Anderson, Tom Paxton, early 20s, and they're coming from different parts of the country. Again, many of them were college dropouts or they just finished college. They're 20, 21, 22, 23 years old. And now, in contrast to, say, Dave Van Ronk, who would interpret traditional ballads going back to the 1930s, collected by the likes of Alan and John Lomax for the Library of Congress, these field recordings, um, they're writing their own songs now. They're probing themselves, they're introspective. Sometimes they're romantic songs. In the case of Phil Oakes, they're often topical political songs about what's going on in the moment in the country, with whether the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Civil Rights Movement. So we're seeing the emergence of the budding singer-songwriter, I think, in the early 60s. And there's a whole cohort of them, if you will. Some of them did become famous, most of them did not, but they're all sort of there. And there's this great sense of peer pressure, and I mean that in a positive sense. There's a constellation of venues surrounding Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, about 25 of them in 1961. And they, again, would afford you the opportunity, a young singer-songwriter, immersed in this folk music tradition, but also writing your own material to try out new songs, to experiment with new songs in these venues, to see how the audience responds to them, to give you the opportunity to see if you can hold an audience's attention. And again, it was almost like their university, if you will, these venues, places like Gertie's Folk City, the Gaslight Cafe, the village gates, the bitter end on Bleecker Street. So they're all concentrated here, and you're seeing each other, you're hearing each other, you're exchanging ideas, you're going out for a beer afterwards, sometimes getting these great ideas from conversations afterwards, these sparks of inspiration. So I think this is what made Greenwich Village in the early 60s distinct. The concentration of these venues, the influx of young, talented, bold, naive singer-songwriters from all over the country coming there, trying out, exchanging. And there you can meet a manager, somebody like Albert Grossman, who was depicted in the film, to manage you, or you can get a contract with Columbia Records or Folkways, Elektra, Vanguard Records. They're all in New York City. So New York is also the commercial infrastructure. So for a
Mm.
number of reasons, New York is different, is distinct from Boston, Cambridge, from Chicago, from LA, from small college towns like Oberlin and Berkeley. And it really gives an opportunity to somebody young, ambitious, and restless like Dylan to really ascent rapidly because everything is in flux.
Yeah.
This isn't a stagnant period, but it's a vibrant period, the early 60s, where you could have that opportunity to ascent. And Dylan, I mean, he was especially talented, of course, but in this, against this backdrop, he really, of course, ascended, and those years were tremendous, 1963 to about 1966. Look at his records.
Yeah, and it's Van Ronk. It feels like in many ways portrayed as the guy that was kind of bitter about Dylan's rise. I mean, the Coen Brothers movie Inside Llewyn Davis portrays loosely, I think, that story of watching Dylan come and sort of capitalize on a scene. That's one way of seeing it, but it's how much of it was a generational thing because it seems like I'm just kind of trying to wrap my mind around how much this was located in like college towns and New York and San Francisco and these sort of like bases because there's clips in the documentaries about Berkeley in the 1960s in the early part of the free speech movement in 1964. Everyone seems tuned in to Phil Oakes and Joan Baez. Everyone knows all the lyrics of their songs and is singing. And I'm thinking, how big is this nationally? Because obviously the film does portray Columbia Records and the big companies trying to capitalize on this too. I'm just trying to figure out sort of how big folk music really was. Was it the popular music of the era, or was it just the kids?
No, I think it was from say 58 to 64, if I would were to periodize it, 6 years or so, give or take, spill over a little bit after as well. But in this time period, you had nationally prominent shows on ABC like Hootenanny, which on Saturday evenings. That was a big hit. It was also controversial because they banned Pete Seeger, of course, because of his political views and his affiliations and testimony going back to the 50s in front of Congress. But that, and there was a real hootenanny craze. There were products, hootenanny t-shirts, blankets, pinball machines, a Miss Hootenanny contest. So for sure, 63, 64, folk music was nationally popular, but it was indeed based in cities and in college towns. But it did find an audience, I would say, nationwide. And then, of course, we're going to see a turn with the British invasion in 1964, as well as with the emergence of the hybrid folk rock movement, if you will. So Dylan, the Turtles, the Birds out in
Mhm.
California
Yeah.
were all emblematic of this folk rock movement, this fusion of different styles. And Dylan would be a leader in that as well. But yeah, for sure, I think, going back to 58 with the Kingston Trio with their hit Tom Dooley, music historians look at a decline in rock and roll by the late 1950s. There are different payola scandals. Elvis is in the army.
Mm.
A lot of the lyrics were thought to be a bit superficial, kind of the moon in June, baby, I love you on the surface. But with folk music, I mean, these people are singing about labor, they're singing about struggle, they're singing about marriage, life, death, play. And a lot of it, you're right, earlier goes back to the 19th century. These recordings were made, many of them in the 1930s, by people like Alan and John Lomax. John the father, Alan the son, Zora Neale Hurston for the Library of Congress. So tens of thousands of songs. They went to 33 states at least to mostly rural areas. And there was a sense of urgency too, because the nation's becoming increasingly urban. Radio is changing the way we appreciate music in the 1930s. And there's this concern, well, we're losing these songs which had been passed orally. So now we need to record them. And yeah, a lot of those songs being recorded and then yeah, and then probed by people in the 50s like Dave Van Ronk, Harry Smith published this or recorded this anthology for Folkways Records in 1952.
Love
That was
that
really
Harry Smith
that
anthology.
was
Yeah,
very seminal, very seminal.
yeah.
But so yeah. But by the early 60s, we are seeing a bit of a shift now, like a new generation, younger folks, not necessarily from rural areas in the South, in the Midwest, or elsewhere, but
That's what's sort
middle.
of funny about it, right? Like
Yeah,
you're talking about the Greenwich Village scene, and so much of this folk music is kind of rural and is kind of about rural people and their experiences. The character that is, I guess, supposed to be Suze Rotolo in this film, played by Elle Fanning, is she sort of stands in for a little of that attitude when she says to Dylan, like, "Look, you don't have to sing songs about the Dust Bowl." Anymore. We have nuclear bombs. We have JFK. We have the civil rights movement. There are other things to sing about. But I was wondering, how much of that. It's funny because Hootenanny, I'm just imagining, is trying to portray folk music a little bit in a sanitized way, right? Like they're trying to keep out that commie stuff. And it's interesting because there seems like there's a tension within folk music, even beyond the rock and roll tension. There's like a folk music tension between like what this music really is about. Because Pete Seeger, at least as he's portrayed by Edward Norton in this movie, is someone who really seems to want to direct folk music to a particular left wing kind of message. And if Hootenanny's not letting that stuff on there, what's Hootenanny about?
yeah. You're absolutely right. And this really disturbed people who are referred to as purists or people on the political left, like Pete Seeger or Erwin Silber from Sing Out magazine, these old leftist organizations and institutions and figures. Yeah, there was also the emergence of pop folk, if you will, emblematic in the Chad Mitchell Trio. So many other groups, the Kingston Trio,
Hmm.
even Peter, Paul, and Mary to some degree, but they were considered to be more political and respectful of traditions. So there was frustration for those who were interested in authenticity. Like
Mm.
these new sanitized groups that you're seeing perform on Hootenanny, button down guys, polished, slick, they're not truly authentic. They're just looking to capitalize on this commercial boom.
Mm.
So within the folk music community, there was significant resentment. People like Izzy Young, who owned the Folklore Center in Greenwich Village on McDougal Street, were very, yeah, frustrated that they were getting recognition and doing well on a commercial level. Meanwhile, these older folks from the 20s and 30s from rural areas, Mississippi, John Hurt, for example, were relatively unknown. Doc Watson, people that Harry Smith recorded in his 1952 anthology. So, yeah, there was this concern about authenticity, if you will, and that really hinged upon maybe your regional background, maybe your class or race identity.
Yeah.
Or in the case of someone like Dave Van Ronk, who was from New York City, he was very respectful of traditions. He was a student and he really tried to understand different kinds of music, different trends. So he wasn't dismissed because you can see he was sincere and respectful. But other people, like these slick college groups, like the Limelighters or the Chad Mitchell Trio, were often dismissed by folk music purists and also people on the left. And that's really important here.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't know if the movie really gets into that enough. You see Pete Seeger, he's earnest and sincere and saintly. And, he sees, as you say, Dylan as the successor to Woody in many ways, but oh, he's going off in a different direction. And I think the movie might have emphasized acoustic versus electric more than politics. I think the movie didn't do enough with politics because
Yeah,
I think
that's
that's what
interesting.
Pete was upset by. Because don't forget that Pete was the leader of the Weavers in the late 40s and early 50s, and they were very commercially successful. They were wearing tuxedos, playing in these swank nightclubs in New York and LA and Houston. Big hits, top of the charts with Goodnight Irene, their rendition of Leadbelly's song. So Pete was okay. He wasn't a critic of people selling out to rock and roll, playing electric guitar. But I think he was more dismayed that Dylan was sort of breaking off from the political wing of the folk music community.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the way that Edward Norton portrays Pete Seeger, yeah, he's saintly. There's a little bit of tragedy to him in this movie, and there's even like a little bit of like a character you've seen in a million of the like kind of '60s movies that almost like not quite a villain, but a sort of foil that is the guy that's going to like rip out all the chords while he's performing so the kids can't listen to this, you know. And there's a scene that is really seems like a pivotal scene in the film where Pete Seeger shows up to Dylan's hotel room before the Newport Festival in '65 and sort of gives him a pitch. And the pitch is, we've been trying to, he uses a metaphor of a seesaw. And he says, we've been trying to sort of put some weight on the other end of an imbalanced seesaw, and put with our little teaspoons of sand. And he's like our little folk music, and we've been trying to do something. And Bob, you came along and you had a shovel, and you've been really helping us. And I feel like if you just go out there and perform these folk songs one last time, we can tip that seesaw. Something about him to me comes off as sort of like hopelessly naive in some ways, and that's certainly how the other people, including Dylan, react to him. They say like, "Come on, nothing's changing. Malcolm X got killed, JFK got killed, and all of our folk music isn't doing anything. Let's try something different." That's sort of the attitude. But I thought that was really interesting the way that the film portrayed that because it does, even if it's maybe a Hollywood sort of reductive vision of that, it does capture some fundamental tension within kind of cultural politics, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and you described it beautifully. That scene that morning when the morning when he goes electric, when Pete
Right.
leans on Bob a little bit in his earnest and sincere way, like we need you to remain in this movement. And you can see Dylan's increasingly skeptical. He doesn't feel obligated to be part of any kind of political movement or cause. He's embracing his artistic creativity and it's taking him in this direction. Again, he doesn't feel connected to a particular cause. And yeah, that is really the tension to me. Absolutely. And I think to be fair, 1963, Dylan's breakthrough album comes out. It's his second album, famous, of course, Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. And there are many political songs, both topical as well as anthems like Blowin' in the Wind, Masters of War, that critique of the military-industrial Cold War, that complex. And then this next album would come out in January 1964. It was The Times They Are A-Changing. Many political songs, topical songs about the civil rights movement, about nuclear disarmament. And 1963, David, represented Dylan's deepest involvement in the civil rights movement. And I'm not suggesting he was on the front lines. But he did sing at a voter registration rally in 1963 in Greenwood, Mississippi,
Mhm.
with Pete Seeger and Theo Bickel. He did perform on the March on Washington. Mind you, it was an underwhelming performance, but he was there in August 1963. And also, one thing the film did not get, one of my frustrations, was the 1963 Newport Folk Festival. I think if you can only appreciate 65 if you know really about 63 and 64, because at 63 he played a lot of political material. He was 21, 22 years old at the time from Freewheelin', and especially the encore that night, one of those nights. He was out on stage with Peter, Paul, and Mary, with the SNCC Freedom Singers, four of them, with Seeger, and they were all linking arms. They sang "Blowin' in the Wind," and they sang "We Shall Overcome." And
Wow.
it was very much an intergenerational, interracial moment. Some people say it was the high point of the folk music revival, July 1963, when the civil rights movement is reaching an emotional and legislative peak or approaching that. And so you could be forgiven if you thought that Dylan was a political singer in 1963.
Right.
I mean, just look at his music,
Yeah.
and look at his he played at civil rights rallies, at City College of New York, fundraisers for SNCC. He's dating Susie Rotolo, who is a member of CORE, a child of a red diaper baby from Queens. Her parents were in the American Communist Party. Pete, I think, built up hopes that, okay, yeah, I'm seeing it firsthand myself. I'm not imagining this. I'm just listening to his music and freewheeling, and the times they are changing. And it's very much suggesting that he's going to, yeah, as you say, take the torch from Woody Guthrie. And of course, the civil rights movement at the time represented the fusion of music and politics. You can't imagine the civil rights movement without "We Shall Overcome," "This Little Light of Mine," "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize," "We Shall Not Be Moved." It was fundamentally a singing movement, and Pete was absolutely delighted by this. He actually modified "We Shall Overcome" at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee in the late 1950s. This song was taught to SNCC activists.
Hmm.
So, for all these reasons, Pete has this great hope. Now we've got singing movements that are really seemingly changing people's sensibilities. At least that's what the thought was circa 1963, 64. So to see Dylan break away, I think, yeah, Pete built hopes up. And he was disappointed. I think less so because of the electric guitar and more so because of the politics.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's funny because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading of the ending of this film, and I don't think I'm giving anything away. I think people know Dylan's biography in general. But at the end of the movie, Woody Guthrie, he sort of, I think Dylan goes to Woody Guthrie back in the hospital, and it feels like Dylan himself is almost disappointed in himself for like walking away from, or allegedly walking away from that political spirit. And he decides to go give the harmonica back to Woody Guthrie as if to say, I'm not that anymore. I'm not carrying on your legacy. And Woody Guthrie in the hospital pushes the harmonica back to Dylan as if to say, no, you are the legacy. You carry that torch. And the last shot of the film is him riding away on his motorcycle, a very rebellious American image. And there's something, you get kind of a kick at the end of the movie of like, yeah, Dylan did the right thing because he's going to forge his own path. And that's actually captures Woody Guthrie's spirit more than any other like dogmatic political exercise, if that makes sense. And I have to admit, I kind of like that vision of Dylan, as much as I am moved by all of the civil rights movement songs and moved by Joan Baez. And when I listen to those songs, God, they're so good. They're just actually heartbreaking. It's like hard not to cry listening to a lot of that political material. I'm a sucker for that stuff. But I'm also a sucker for like the vision of Dylan as the guy that does his own thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you articulated the tension. I think Dylan, on the one hand, represents this rugged individualism, which is such a prominent trend in American cultural history. We forge our own paths. Whereas Pete Seeger is more collective and communal. The
Yes.
folk music movement, uh, yeah, there's leftist affiliations, I think more in the late 30s, early 40s when Pete was on the Almanac Singers during the early period of World War II. But I see it more as communal and collective. In Pete, Pete believed we should get America singing, and not because it's going to lead to reform tomorrow, but it's going to increase empathy. It's going to foster solidarity. It's part of a broader process. It brings people together. You know, if you sing at a demonstration, at a rally, at a sit-in, at a protest, it's invigorating, and it does increase this solidarity in the sense of communalism. But Dylan, you're right. There is something very American about him here. I'm going to be this rugged individualist. I'm going to pursue my own interests, my self-interests, and I'm an artist. I'm not beholden to anybody, any
Hmm.
cause, any movement. You're trying to pin that on me. You're depicting me as the voice of a generation. I reject this. And yeah, he goes off on his motorcycle and he's going to eventually go to upstate New York and make new albums there. And he's cheered on by Johnny Cash too. Johnny Cash, like, it really supports him. And there was an element of truth to that as well at the time. Johnny Cash first met Dylan at the 1964 Newport Folk Festival,
Hmm.
and that's when people on the left first really criticized him, like Irwin Silber from Sing Out magazine heard Dylan's set at Newport in 1964, and is from his forthcoming album, Another Side of Bob Dylan, and said, Bob, what happened? You're so introspective and insular and personally bitter. Your songs. Uh, and Johnny Cash wrote a letter in Broadside magazine and said, "Shut up, let him sing, let him sing." And Dylan deeply, deeply appreciated that.
Mm.
So that was correct. Even if they got many facts about Cash wrong, the fundamental portrayal was right.
I liked Johnny Cash's presence in this movie, and he was. It's funny because the director of this film he also did Walk the Line, the Joaquin Phoenix Johnny Cash. So it's clear that he has like James Mangold is the name of the director. Who he it's clear he has some interest in this era and these sort of iconoclasts of rock and kind of country folk music of this era. But it's funny because I don't know, like thinking about Dylan. I think about this. I think it's in the No Direction Home documentary that Joan Baez says, that she went to an anti-war rally in the mid 60s at some point, and when she would go to anti-war rallies, people would say, "Where's Bob? Why isn't he here?" And she was just like, "He's not gonna be here. That's just not him." And I think the movie does capture something about like the sort of split between Dylan as a person and the people that knew him intimately, like Joan Baez, that sort of knew the guy, versus the like public persona. And there was a sort of expectation that people had that, yeah, he was that civil rights anti-war sort of activist when that was never really him. It was
No,
sort of maybe that's why so many people were angry about him in the scene because they thought this guy wants to make our music, but he's not committed to the cause.
yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And people were disappointed. Joan Baez too, and it's exactly right. No, of course, Bob. No, Bob's not going to be here. Where's Bob? Bob's not interested in this. He's pursuing his own path. And yeah, many people were very frustrated during the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, but I think ultimately accepted the idea that Bob is not going to be part of a movement, part of a cause. I always attributed it in my own writing. Uh, I don't know, maybe I'm off base, that it wasn't even just politics, but even personal attachments. If you
Yeah.
study
Yes.
Dylan's career, I think he's married. I might be getting this wrong, but I think I'm right, maybe like six times or something. So
Hmm.
even in his personal relationships, he did not maintain them for very long because I don't think he wanted to be attached to any political cause, any person even. Um,
He's uncomfortable socially, it seems like.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, the punchline that I love at the end of this film with the text that appears on the screen that gives you a little bit of a post history of what happened to everybody. The last thing it says is that Dylan is the first or the only singer-songwriter to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he didn't show up to the ceremony. And I love that. I mean, obviously, that's an intentional. They chose to end the film with that punch in part to recognize that Dylan really doesn't feel beholden to anybody else, and he seems very, very uncomfortable being part of a crowd, which is a kind of fundamental tension, with, especially with his early music, that seems like it's about, hey, let's save the world, but also the guy that's singing this song is a guy that doesn't want to talk to anybody else. I think that's actually very identifiable in some way, especially like if you're around the left. You do recognize that there are a lot of curmudgeons on the left, and I've always thought to myself, God, all these people who are so interested in building a communal sort of movement seem like they don't really like people. And there's something funny about that.
Yeah, somebody should do a study of that. People who happen to be effective on stage delivering a speech, maybe a great orator in a crowd, but
Yeah.
on a personal level, uncomfortable, uneasy, in fact, private, but you really flourish in a big crowd speaking, or in Dylan's case, playing music. He's got this enormous talent for performing on stage. But even when he is on stage, he doesn't connect with his audience. There's not like this banter between songs, like say Bono from U2
Right.
is offering his commentary between songs, connecting. Pete Seeger leading crowds in a sing-along. Can you imagine Bob Dylan leading a
No.
crowd in a sing? No,
Well,
he
there's a clip of what I think it's the guy Penn the magician. I don't know why this clip came up on my algorithm, but probably because it was folk music has been on the timeline lately. But he's talking about exactly this with regards to Bruce Springsteen. And he says like the difference between Springsteen and Dylan is just tremendous, even though they're often compared as both maybe both kind of like the legacy of Woody Guthrie in some ways. I mean, Springsteen is known for leading his crowds in "This Land Is Our Land" kind of thing, and like he's very much in that tradition. But Springsteen really pleases the crowd and really reaches out to everybody, and Dylan does not. Dylan does he'll play whatever songs he wants, and he'll walk off the stage, and it seems like there's a different vision of what an artist is supposed to be there that seems actually kind of profound and does capture something about the 60s a little bit.
I think so. I think so. And I think
Hmm.
you're really hitting upon it now, like Dylan in many ways enigmatic. And I'm
Yeah.
actually happy that James Mangold didn't try to solve this enigma that is Bob Dylan and really probe him, his character, his persona, his psyche. We just sort of see him on the surface, and he's evolving. His clothing style changes, his look changes, and that, but we don't really get a sense of his inner psyche. So I'm sort of glad this biopic didn't try to penetrate Dylan and explore that.
Yeah, me too.
And good for Mangold. And I think that might have, interestingly, side note, might have hurt Timothy Chalamet's Oscar chances, because someone said, and this wasn't a pun, they said he was sort of like a one note actor, like he didn't have to do that character, that deep character study. He learned the music, he sang the music and all of that, but you
Yes.
don't really see his psychological evolution. And that might have actually hurt Chalamet on that level.
Yeah, but he captures the enigma really well, I felt like,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's true. It is I was it's very easy to do an impression of this Dylan because he's it's all cryptic. It's all like sometimes you talk to a doctor, sometimes you need a medicine man. Like he's just got that. That's just how he talks all the time. And I'm wondering like almost in the same way that I thought about with Val Kilmer playing Jim Morrison in the Doors movie. I'm like, was this guy really talking this way all the time in like lizard poetry, or was like, where's the real guy? Where's the real person? But that's part of like Dylan's mystique, right? The other movie that I'm thinking about is the Todd Haynes movie, I'm Not There, I think it's called, that
Yeah.
with all the different actors, Tilda Swinton even playing. No, it's Kate Blanchett,
Kate
not
Blanchett.
Tilda Swinton. It's Kate Blanchett playing Dylan. But I thought that movie would like took that on, in a very interesting way because it's like, Dylan is this sort of yeah, enigmatic figure.
Yeah, and I liked the Todd Haynes I'm Not There. I want to say it was from 2007. As you
Hmm.
say, six different people portraying Dylan at six different periods. And yeah, this notion of reinventing yourself, reimagining yourself. And that I thought was an effective portrayal. A lot of the subtle references I think will go over people's heads because it was really like esoteric in many ways, but nevertheless brilliantly done. Um, and yeah, I also thought New York was really the perfect place for Dylan on that level in the early 60s because to some degree we all sort of reimagine and reinvent ourselves in New York City.
That's a great
You
point.
know,
Yeah.
you go from, I believe you're from California
Yep.
originally, and you go to New York and you're evolving at the CUNY Grad Center as a researcher, as a teacher, as a curator. And I'm okay with that. Some people like, oh wow, Dylan is such just a set of shifting personas. His identity is so fluid. But I think we're all kind of like that. People in the LGBTQ community who had to remain in the closet could maybe come out in certain places in New York City, or even African Americans, Puerto Ricans moving to the city. Of course, this is a different context. They're facing persecution.
That's a
Um,
great point, though. I thought a really smart idea is that that sort of like Dylan is not so unique, that we are all fluid personalities, and the city can be a
yeah,
kind of machine for producing
yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, even Ramblin' Jack Elliott, who was actually from Brooklyn, middle class and Jewish, Elliot Adnapas from Flatbush, so he changes his name as well. Um, and yeah, I think people maybe draw too much attention to that, but the city did, especially at that time and at other times as well, afford you the opportunity to try out your, new ideas, becoming a new self and new ways in politics or on a personal level, connected to a movement. Yeah, so that was also, I think, important to Dylan's ascent too, not just the commercial opportunities, but New York as a place to reimagine yourself.
Yeah, it seems I feel like there's a conversation in the movie at some point between him and the Susie Rotolo character who says something along the lines of, someone finding themselves, and Dylan really doesn't like that idea. He's like, you don't find yourself like you're a shoe that's already pre-made. But there is a sense, I feel like I'm even thinking of, like, I don't know, Leroy Jones becoming a Miri Baraka, and that especially in the 60s, there is introduced this notion of a fluid identity, that you mentioned, like this sort of burgeoning gay movement that becomes much more pronounced in the 70s and 80s. But it seems like, in a really offhand way, Dylan personifies a little bit of that larger sort of notion that human identity isn't so fixed. And I like that, appreciate about that about him. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely,
Hmm.
absolutely. Yeah, we
Uh,
we certainly see that in Dylan, and no, I think that is a critical aspect of his development.
Why do you think this movie is why they decided to make a Dylan movie now? Because it's just Dylan just keeps coming back. It's so funny to me because it's like, in a lot of ways, the nostalgia trap of the 60s is just like we're stuck with this same baby boomer stories told over and over again. And yet, watching A Complete Unknown, I really enjoyed it, even though it rehearsed a lot of the same hits. Here's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's the JFK assassination, that sort of stuff. It seems like it does have some sort of relevance to our modern moment. It seems like Dylan just keeps returning. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, right. I think that's a great question.
I know it's
You
not one answer to it, but
Yeah, no, no. I mean, he really, of course, stands out, and there were many significant figures, of course, in politics and culture from that era. But Dylan's breakthrough was so profound and so rapid, and people are just still trying to wrap their heads around it. And he's still performing today.
yeah.
Um, And I think it really does like capture a moment, tension in America at that time. Is it relevant today? The tension between, say, individualism and communalism.
Mm,
I don't know. I don't, I mean, it has resonance, but yeah, I mean, this goes back to the Dylan team, if you will, purchased the rights to the book,
mm,
Wald's book, Dylan Goes Electric. That was back in 2017, and they were keen on making a film as early as that. Ultimately, found James Mangold and then Timothy Chalamet in 2019. It was supposed to come out much earlier, but then the pandemic hit in 2020, so it got postponed. And so it's been 5.5, 7 years or so in the making. But yeah, relevance today, I don't know. I don't know if we need to like latch on to great artists as we try to find our way in today's culture.
mm.
Um,
Chalamet has been on, he's done the circuit, and the few interviews I've seen with him, he has talked about how he wanted to bring Dylan to a younger generation, which is interesting, right? He's like he wants the kids to hear Bob Dylan music and maybe get into it, and I don't know what he envisions that doing, but I was in I collect, I'm one of those nerds that collects vinyl records, and I was in a record shop recently, and there were young people there interested in buying Bob Dylan records, and it was sort of mind-blowing to think that we're this many decades past the 60s. And the movie, clearly made some people want to listen to Bob Dylan.
yeah.
Yeah, it's weird because it's sort of like he is a kind of timeless creature in a lot of ways. I always imagine that somehow Dylan's going to outlive all of us. Um,
And
which
Keith
is,
Richards.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great point. And I heard the same thing that a new generation is being introduced to Dylan, and to a lesser extent, Joan Baez and even Pete Seeger, as well as a result of this film, because Timothy Chalamet obviously is a internationally prominent actor, so he has that capacity. And even I was interviewed by The Guardian about the Dylan Baez relationship, and
Yeah.
many Gen Z women were identifying with Joan Baez, like in almost scratching their heads, like, how could you, date this guy? He was a bit dismissive and often prickly, not always honest with you. And so they're revisiting Joan Baez as well. And that's I think, yeah, a good thing in many ways, because I go back, David, to my exhibit, Folk City, at the Museum of the City of New York in 2015 and 2016. We did 6 programs, one of which was actually on the 50th anniversary of Dylan Goes Electric. I had Elijah Wald, David Haydu, who wrote about Dylan, and Joan Baez, Richard and Mimi Farina, and Terry Thal, who was Dylan's first manager, Dave Van Ronk's wife. We had 250 people there. But in that program and all the other programs that we had to accompany the exhibit, I'd say the average age was about 60.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
the audiences were not racially diverse at all. They were middle class, white, probably, from boomers, I would, yeah, 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 from that generation. So it wasn't diverse by generation. And now at least we're seeing some people interested in Dylan. So I think that's a good thing that 20 people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s are starting to probe Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
because he was just off their radar. It almost might have been ancient history to that demographic.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, after Dylan, in the way they portrayed in this film, after Dylan plays the electric songs at the Newport Folk Festival, much to the disappointment of Pete Seeger and the other folk purists, uh, it's Joan. Is it Joan Baez? It might be the Sue Rotolo. One of them says, I think it's Joan Baez that says, "You won. Why are you sulking? You won. You won the cultural conversation." And in some ways, I mean, the folk music of the '60s, you already periodized for us. It does kind of go away, right? Like its cultural cachet is over really by the mid '60s, and something else is born.
Yeah, yeah, with the emergence of folk rock and the British invasion, the
Yeah.
Stones, the Beatles, the Kinks, Led Zeppelin, and Yeah. I mean, sure, there is still folk music lingering, but it's off the radar for sure. And the focus is on rock and roll. And even in the scene, I think to a large degree shifts from New York to California.
Yeah.
With counterculture groups like the Grateful Dead in San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury emerging 65, 66.
It's old left, new left in a lot of ways. Yeah, because
Yeah,
there is
yeah.
that the human being that takes place, I think, in 1966, in which, it was an attempt to get together like the old left and SDS and all those kind of groups alongside this counterculture that's happening, this LSD thing that's happening in San Francisco. And, there were groups there that were sort of angry, especially the left, the old left groups were sort of angry at the drugged out sort of direction of things and thought, we're losing the spirit here and we're going into something more hedonistic. And that tension has never really been resolved. And so when I'm thinking about that tension as playing out in A Complete Unknown, a film that comes out in 2024, there are conversations right now about sort of media and how we reach people and how I mean, we're sitting here doing a podcast, right? And it's sort of like there were a lot of people. I don't know if this connection is direct, but a lot of people mad that Bernie Sanders went on a Joe Rogan program, right? And they're
Mm.
like, why are you going on there? That's like that's the right wing sort of network, or that's like something that we shouldn't be engaging with. And it feels like this movie, in part, is somehow, without directly touching that territory, is kind of a nod to this idea that there are different ways of reaching people. There are different ways of sort of figuring out how to navigate mass culture, if that makes sense. And Dylan is someone who was sort of riding in between all of those things, and his sort of resistance to really nailing himself down as one thing or another, in some ways, was his greatest strength, I feel like. But it also made a lot of people mad that wanted him to be a certain thing. Yeah.
Yeah. There is a lot of splintering happening then, the late 60s. True with the counterculture. I think there's the line from, I'll paraphrase the leftist historian Eugene Genovese, who couldn't stand the counterculture. He said something like Stalin would know what to do with them. You know,
Yeah.
that he's coming from that
Yeah, I mean, like Timothy
sensibility.
Leary saying "tune in, turn on, drop out" was about the opposite thing that groups like SDS wanted to hear and wanted to sort of promulgate in the culture. They didn't want people dropping out. They wanted people joining them and being part of this revolution. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, real tension and yeah, and Dylan was just a unique figure, just did not want to be pinned down and really just had such resentment towards these media portrayals or college presidents. I think he won an honorary award at Princeton in the late 60s, early 70s, and the Princeton president introduced him in this manner, the voice of a generation. He just was so annoyed by it all and really
Yeah.
yeah, stopped doing. He became even more reclusive and rarely did interviews, people always trying to peg him down, pin him down, pigeonhole him. He just had no patience for any of this.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's funny because I ended up really liking the Dylan that was portrayed in this movie. Yeah.
Yeah, you think because of this rugged individual persona that he's going to pursue his own path. And
Hmm.
is that what appealed to you?
Yeah, I think so. And just Chalamet's performance of Dylan was sort of there's something funny about him and charming about him, even though, ironically, as many characters point out, he's kind of an asshole. I think Joan Baez literally calls him that, and I think he just kind of his response is just to shrug. I certainly think that character doesn't really fit into, yeah, a communal movement. But at the same time, there was something admirable about that, especially when I think of him more as an artist than as a political activist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And Also, it's worth noting and even emphasizing that Dylan's manager, Jeff Rosen, was executive producer of this film.
Mm,
Dylan himself met with James Mangold 5 or 6 times to review the script and ultimately approved the script. Even that
interesting.
line, like, Bob, you're kind of an asshole. He and Dylan, in fact, had tremendous respect for all of those individuals, Baez, Guthrie, Seeger, Cash, even if there were disagreements. And you were correct to say that Pete Seeger became the antagonist, but he wasn't a villain per se.
Mm-mm.
He was
Mm-mm.
there was no good guys, bad guys, simple
I
binary.
love the Pete Seeger character. I thought Edward Norton was amazing in this movie, actually. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think so too. I think he really nailed Pete's persona, how sincere and earnest and committed he was to this.
Yeah.
So I thought that was beautifully done. The
Mm.
acting, I think, again, exceptional. Joan Baez. Some people are critical that Susie Rotolo was too passive and weak. I talked to people who knew Susie very well, and she was very political, very strong-minded. She seemed to be a little reactive to some. The
Mm-hmm.
Elle Fanning character.
I could see
Susie,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. I really enjoyed talking with you about it. It makes me think of one last thing about the last thoughts on Woody Guthrie, I think it's called, which is like a spoken word thing. I'm sure you've heard Dylan do that. When Woody Guthrie died, that's always been one of my favorite pieces by Bob Dylan, and I'll post a link to it in the episode description here so people can listen to his voice reading it because it's obvious that he has a real deep reverence for Guthrie, but not just as a left wing activist, as someone who was really tuned into a spirit in American life. And that comes through in this movie. And it makes sense to me in a little like when Guthrie gives him the harmonica back at the end of this film, it made sense to me that I think they might be overplaying a little bit that Guthrie recognized something in Dylan of like, yeah, you're like me. Like that independent spirit is what's really important here, and that may actually not completely dissolve all the left wing stuff. That actually that those two things can be in harmony in some ways, and that's the hope of the movie to me in some ways.
Yeah, that's really perceptive. And I think there was that affection and respect mutual. And of course, as you say, Dylan had great admiration for Guthrie, but it was mutual. And there was something about Dylan, even as he did break away, and Guthrie's own rootlessness. Remember, I mean, he's run from Oklahoma to Texas to California to New York. So he himself on just a sheer geographic level, but like was, always on the move, on the go, evolving. Uh, and there's something about Dylan's rootlessness
Mm,
too that
mm,
that is of appeal there, that
yeah.
individualistic nature.
Makes you think, and I think that's part of what I appreciate about Dylan's whole sort of existence and all his output is that it's filled with contradictions, and those are the kind of things that kind of light up your consciousness, especially if you're a scholar of this era and you like thinking about this era. Stephen Petrus, really great talking with you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, David, it was wonderful. Great speaking with you as well. Thank you for this opportunity and your insight. I really appreciated it.
Well, all right, my friends. I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap this week. I want to thank my guest, Stephen Petrus, for a really fun conversation. I love talking about Bob Dylan, and Stephen has so much knowledge about the folk music scene of this era. Go check out his book. It's called Folk City, New York City and the American Folk Music Revival. It's got the whole world that's sort of missing from this film, a complete unknown. And it's not a weakness of the movie at all. The movie is sort of hyper focused on Dylan as a personality and this one particular fight within the folk music world. But there's so much more to learn about this, and I can't recommend that Scorsese documentary No Direction Home enough. That's a really great take and a really great education in this whole world of folk music that is sort of mind-blowing, honestly, when you think about the cultural production that this country has put out and how it's shaped so much of who we are and how we think about where we're headed. So that's really fun stuff. Go check it out. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you to Nostalgia Trap listeners. Go check out our Patreon page as well. We appreciate it. The links are in the episode description. We'll be back again next week with more News Trap episodes. And yeah, let's keep on trucking. See you soon. Bye-bye.